I still remember every detail of the day the world ended. The war with the humans was the longest and bitterest we'd ever fought. By the time it was over, our fleets were all but wiped out, and half our colonies were devastated. But we didn't see any of that on our homeworld, our beloved Tyrax. The fighting was always somewhere far, far away, across the vast reaches of the galaxy. We saw the trade with the outer colonies dropping off. We saw the messages of condolence being delivered to families of soldiers serving at the front. But that was war, and that had always been war. We were a martial people, and we had defended our interests across the known galaxy. The fighting never reached Tyrax itself, never, and we went about our lives as we always had, confident in the knowledge that the war would always be somewhere beyond the horizon. True, the trade ships dwindled until 9 out of 10 berths in the orbital docks were empty, and the grieving families multiplied until it seemed like everyone knew someone who'd been killed, or captured, or who'd simply disappeared into the void. It seems stupid in hindsight, but still, it never even crossed our minds that we might lose. There were often tough times during war, but that was when we Tyraxians were at our best. When things were darkest, that was when we shined. If the enemy hit us hard, then we'd get up again and hit them back twice as hard. And in the end, the only difference it would make would be that we'd find victory all the sweeter. Tyraxians never backed down. We never gave up. And we certainly didn't make peace with the likes of humans. So it was a shock, to say the least, when our government told us we were going to surrender. Everyone's first reaction was that it couldn't be true. It must be a mistake. Someone had accidentally released a classified worst-case scenario on the main government channel, or some lowly functionary had made typo, and it was actually the humans who were surrendering. Or the humans had somehow infiltrated and sabotaged our communication systems. However, over the next day, more and more confirmations were released, until it was no longer possible to pretend that it was just a misunderstanding. They were serious. Our government had come to the conclusion that we had lost the war, and we had no choice but to surrender to the humans. The following hours were surreal, almost dreamlike. Everyone stopped what they were doing. No one went to work or school, and there were many people just wandering through the streets in a daze, with no idea what to do with themselves. How could this happen? We never surrendered, not in 1,000 years and 100 wars. Our military was the best in the galaxy, and the conflict with the humans had started so well. Our first attack had wiped out an entire human fleet, and we'd overrun their nearest colonies before they'd had time to gather more forces. We had every strategic advantage on our side. Besides, no matter what the strategic situation, the humans were our mortal enemies. They had sent weapons and other supplies to the Revenese during our war with them, and their colonies were encroaching further and further into our sphere of influence. They were an evil species, endlessly rapacious, taking anything they could get their hands on and given to torturing and murdering any who opposed them. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be. And yet it was. As that truth slowly began to dawn on us, the fear set in. The government was talking about the arrival of human occupation forces. We all knew what that meant. We'd all heard the stories that had made it back to Tyrax as they overran our outlying colonies. Mass executions, purging anyone who could possibly offer resistance. Forced labor of the entire population, beatings and torture a daily occurrence. And worse things that weren't even mentioned on government channels yet still spread in whispered rumor. More than a few people committed suicide before the first human even set foot on Tyrax. Better to go out cleanly with honor than be tortured to death in a slave camp. The government prohibited such actions and urged us to endure the unendurable for the sake of future generations. Being good citizens, most of us listened, although a few of us questioned why we should even bother to follow the government's orders anymore. It was a mark of how bad things were that such people were immediately imprisoned. Across the whole planet, there was the sense that things were unraveling. There were a few sporadic protests, some from soldiers, some from civilians, demanding that we continue the war whatever the cost. The government had had the foresight to realize that people wouldn't react well to the surrender announcement, and had stationed troops whose loyalty could be relied upon at key installations. The most serious disturbances were quickly broken up. The rest fizzled out when they saw no one was joining them. The vast majority of the populace was too stunned to do much of anything. We could only sit and watch and wait for the humans to arrive. It was, what, maybe a month after the proclamation. The day the world ended. The day we surrendered. The government told us nothing, perhaps hoping to prevent a panic. Then one evening it was announced that the human fleet would arrive in orbit tomorrow. There was no panic, only resignation. If this was the end, then we would meet it bravely, as Tyraxians always did. Many said goodbye to their friends and family, then locked themselves away in their apartments to contemplate the sum of their lives before the human death squads began landing. Some of us watched through telescopes as the occupation force arrived in orbit around Tyrax. Their battleships weren't any bigger than ours, but by the ancients, there were a lot of them. I counted more than double the number our largest fleet had fielded at the start of the war. And this was what the humans had after 4 years of fighting. I knew they still had other fleets too, scattered across Tyraxian space, garrisoning captured worlds and hunting down the last remnants of our once mighty military forces. At least now, we knew how we had lost, although that did us little good at this point. The official surrender took place in the empty fighter bay of the human flagship, and was broadcast live on every screen on Tyrax. We expected to watch as our leaders were marched out in front of the enemy commanders and forced to apologize for daring to wage war against a superior species, admit the justness and rightness of the enemy's cause, then swear eternal fealty to the conquerors. That was the way we did these things. Depending on how vindictive the victors were feeling, the conquered leaders might then be executed. Instead, they were given a pen and told to write their names on a piece of parchment. The live transmission was interrupted briefly here by a government announcer, who explained that the parchment was a written list of the surrender terms, and that by writing their names on it, the government officials, and by extension the entire Tyraxian Empire, were recognizing their legality. Strange custom. But that's aliens for you. After the signing, our leaders did give the customary oath of fealty and apology, but it was far less elaborate than expected, as if the humans regarded it as an unimportant postscript to the real act of surrender. And then, that was it. There were no executions and no torture. A few of us began to hope. Most of us held our breath, waiting. Within hours, the first dropships began landing and the occupation forces began moving to take control of the cities. I debated with myself whether to hide away or whether to watch the troops moving through the street outside my apartment. I'd decided that it was better to stay away from the window, maybe offering myself a little protection against random acts of violence. But in the end, I couldn't help myself. First came the tanks, hovering on suspensor fields an inch above the street paving. We had the similar technology, but these ones looked at least twice as heavy as anything we could build. Then came armored personnel carriers, again on suspensor fields. Then in the middle of the column marched the infantry. Rank after rank of powered armor,